reading was familiar and sympathetic enough to cause her to turn her head from where she sat on the edge of the hospital bed, facing the window. Elroy Smith stood just inside the doorway, staring at his daughter. "I hear you're going to be okay, soldier." His attempt at the usual rub was belied by the thinness of his voice, the fear he was trying to hide. Valentine stared for a long moment. "Dad," she said, but the word was without imitation. The two studied one another. Elroy was small, barely 5'6", with jet black hair that waved off his forehead and over the collar of his shirt. He wore expensive, stylish, black framed glasses that he pushed up the bridge of his nose. Realizing too late, his hands were shaking. "Close call." "I've been closer." Valentine turned back to the window. Elroy jammed his hands into the pockets of his baggy pants, knuckling his fingers into nervous fists. "Your mother didn't come. She's going to call you later." He faltered with the carefully constructed speech he had planned all the way to the hospital, his perfect rehearsals crowded out now by the memory of Margaret Peyton's face gone pale when she'd heard. She was worried, but she'll be all right. Her hands had gripped the sides of her wheelchair until they were white. "Is she mad?" His heart broke. He crossed the room to his daughter's bed, holding back his need to reach out to the forlorn figure sitting with her back to him. "Of course not." He worked to keep the casualness in his voice, struggled not to overreact. When had he last seen her this way? When had he last heard such uncertainty in her voice? He couldn't remember. "That was a damned idiotic thing you did, going into a burning building like that." "I know." Her defenselessness was a wound, her soft agreement a glimpse of her pain. His anger disappeared. He found himself staring at her shoulder, the round curve of it beneath the hospital gown, looking smaller than it should. He shifted his weight helplessly. 23 years she had been his daughter, since she was a toddler of barely 18 months. He remembered the day her birth mother had placed her on Margaret's lap. The child's hair had been fairer then, her eyes too large for her face, her curious hands already reaching for the controls of Margaret's chair. It had been the first time since her accident, since Margaret's pelvis had been crushed by a renegade android, that he had felt he had his wife back again. "I'm not saying I'm disappointed. She's neither. If that's what's bothering you," it was unquestionably what was bothering her, and mere assurances on his part weren't going to be a healing salve. He supposed it was a natural thing, daughters wanting to please their mothers, but Valentine's dedication to her transcended mere devotion. Like mother, like daughter, a controller cadet whose young body and career had been broken by a renegade android. Her adopted daughter becoming a controller herself, so successful that in a few short years she had exceeded all expectations in the field her mother had been forced to abandon. Maybe Valentine had charged down the same path her mother had taken to prove to herself that she was not as vulnerable as Margaret. Or maybe it was some payback from daughter to mother. "I'll do it for you, get them for you, kill them all for you." Maybe the child's own personal demons pushed her so hard. After all, long before Valentine could have understood the tragedy that had paralyzed her new mother, there had been 18 fragile months of exposure to God knows what with her biological mother and the machine who called himself her father. Elroy poised himself from the circle of thoughts, an old and weary loop he had traveled a billion times. He adored his daughter, and he had no idea why they sparred at every given opportunity. The older she became, the more he found himself unable to keep his mouth shut. The more he railed at her, the tougher she seemed to become. And here he was again. "Ever the hero," he managed, sarcasm aimed not at her. "Can't you for once just let somebody else do the job?" She said nothing, and he shifted his weight again, groping for words, for relief from his own inability to do what he so desperately wanted, to comfort her. "I was going after Amelia." It was a peculiar statement, complete to her somehow, even revealing. He felt his face warm for reasons he didn't understand. The tone of her voice, perhaps, too fragile to be familiar. He felt as if he had just been handed something. Not exactly the kind of woman who would sit down and wait to be rescued. His sarcasm appalled him. It was as though he couldn't speak to his daughter without the words coming out as a challenge. Old habit, a technique he had long ago developed to deal with a child by whom he had felt surpassed by the time she'd hit her teens. "She seems like a competent woman." He'd met Amelia. She seemed as sane as his daughter was driven, as relaxed about her job as Valentine was passionate. He had been thrilled that the woman his daughter admired so much had struck him as someone with a life beyond being a controller. Of course, you'll probably chew your ass out over this, not that you don't deserve it. Some part of him waited, poised on the lingering edge of his words to see if the technique had found a hold with this subject. I doubt she would risk approving you endangering yourself and letting that young girl risk her life. Woman, she snapped, don't refer to them as girls. He felt a spark of hope. His daughter was nothing if not easily provoked. Took a lot of nerve for her to go in there after you. She has nerve, but I was stupid. She did well with her own sarcasm. She had a reason to go up there, and she found a way. You didn't. Amelia, did you check? He interrupted. She could have been outside already, watching the fire from across the street for all you know. They were still bringing people out. She wouldn't have left while there were still people. Oh, come on, Val. The dullness of his voice came easy now that he had ignited the fight in her. This whole thing wasn't like you either. You didn't even stop to think, did you? She turned away again, her chin down, strands of wavy hair falling forward, hiding what little he could see of her face. Bullseye. For a second, he was distanced from that moment, from her, from himself, from what she meant to him, and he was simply shocked and delighted at his core. Then it all flew back together with a surge of realization. She loves Amelia. She risked her life for another human being because she loves her. Amelia Elroy looked down at his feet, pulled his hands from his pockets, struggling to collect himself. It happened every day. People fell in love, wrote great poems, gave over their essence in reality or symbolism, but he had not expected this, not from her. He had never been able to imagine his daughter allowing such an invasion of self, being capable of focusing all that she was onto another person. He instantly wanted to get back to Margaret, take her in his arms, relay this wonderful news, and just as quickly realized she would not share his joy. She had reservations about Amelia, said she felt uncomfortable in her presence. She already frowned upon her daughter's strict allegiance to her superior. My God, he felt torn by the strength of his relief. What it meant, what he had feared. 18 months in the presence of a being who wasn't human. 18 months in a cocoon of simulated love, pretended paternity. 18 months of the precious beginnings of her life, bonding to something capable only of whatever its massive hypercircuits could emulate. His tongue pressed hard against the back of his lower teeth. May I interrupt? The voice from the doorway caught Roy by surprise. And that's when Amelia enters the hospital room.